be like water as a diplomat, or as anyone, a lawyer, anyone professional. You have to be like water. If you can't go this way, let's flow this way. Let's see if we can find a way. Let's go under. Let's go over. Let's see what we can do.
Welcome to Lawyering Peace, the podcast series that examines the intersection of law and peace negotiations around the world. Join us as we speak with lawyers, diplomats, and other experts who have dedicated their careers to negotiating peace and resolving conflict through legal, political, and diplomatic means. In these conversations, my guests and I explore the legal frameworks that underpin peace negotiations, the challenges of navigating varying political and cultural contexts, and the critical roles that law and diplomacy play in facilitating the peace process. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. I'm deeply honored today to be joined by my guest, Ambassador Louis O'Neill, to talk about his work negotiating and attempting to negotiate a political settlement between the breakaway region of Transnistria and the central government of Moldova. Ambassador O'Neill is a highly regarded international lawyer with extensive experience in criminal law and arbitration, as well as human rights and international development. He was formerly an organized crime and finance crime prosecutor, a White House fellow under former Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he covered the countries of the former Soviet Union as a member of the Department of State's policy planning staff. He also served as the ambassador and head of mission to Moldova for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 2006 until 2008. Lou, welcome to Lawyering Peace.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be with you today. Look forward to a conversation.
Great. Well, for our listeners, let's kick it off with some basic context about the so-called frozen conflict between Moldova and Transnistria. It's existed for over 30 years. And what can you tell us about the political and security landscape, both for Moldova as well as its neighbors, during your time as the head of the OSCE mission in Moldova and the current circumstances today?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's interesting. The conflict in Moldova, the Transnistrian conflict, so-called conflict, the frozen conflict, is substantially the same now when I was ambassador in Moldova as it is today. But the expression of that conflict is completely different because of the developments in the world, the war in Ukraine, the advancement of the EU and NATO. It's the underlying interests are the same. And what we're seeing, though, is a heightened interest and focus given Moldova's potential accession to the European Union. I think it's helpful to back up a little bit, though, and talk about how we got here. And of course, for listeners, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to 15 new states and a lot of introspection and expression of nationalist interests and views. And it led to a, for that time, surprisingly peaceful breakup, but with the exception of Georgia, Moldova, Karabakh, and certain other places where, Chechnya, of course, where there were conflicts. And most of those conflicts have become frozen. The Moldovan conflict was very limited in duration, very short, you could call it a war or conflict, and quickly frozen in place, and still frozen today, even as war rages in Ukraine. We need to understand also the geopolitical ramifications here of this conflict. One of Russia's important interests, in its view, is to prevent the expansion of NATO and to prevent the expansion of the European Union. And so the frozen conflicts in Georgia and in Moldova play an important role in advancing that policy, because what could be less attractive, right, to Article 5 nations than a conflict or a frozen conflict on the territory? And what could be less attractive to European accession than a country riven in pieces and partially occupied? There's also a geoeconomic element to the Transnistrian conflict, right? Because all of the or substantially all of the heavy industry in Moldova is located on East Bank Transnistria. And that's power plants and the MMZ, which is the steel factory there, and other important industry. And so there's also that element to it. And the element that a frozen conflict can lead to a regulation-free environment for certain actors. And some would call it a black hole, some would call it, as I am here, a regulation-free environment, but it does lead to economic opportunities that are very attractive to many parties in the conflict. So you've got the geopolitical element, you've got the geoeconomic element, you have, at a personal level, you have linguistic issues and cultural issues, historical reckonings that are at play. So it's a very complicated area and that's why we have this conflict still 30 years on after it was frozen.
So Lou, how did you find yourself as head of mission of the OSCE trying to help sort this conflict? You have an eclectic and dynamic background. Walk our listeners through how you ended up with such a pivotal position and an opportunity to make a difference in building peace.
Well, you're very generous to say we made a difference. It's a difficult nut to crack, and successors of mine and others have tried for years, and we're still sort of frozen in the conflict, but we do our best. We'll talk more about the efforts we made and others have made after that. But my story of getting to this position in Moldova is an interesting one. So I began my career as a corporate lawyer in an international firm. And then I became as you mentioned, an organized crime and financial crimes prosecutor in New York. And I did that for a number of years and learned quite a bit about transnational groups and how things work in certain spheres. And I applied in my fourth year as a prosecutor to become a White House fellow. It's an application process. It's kind of a leadership and policy training program. 12 to 19 Americans every year are selected and are paired essentially one-on-one with a cabinet secretary and an educational program, and to shadow and learn how government works. And I was selected, and I was put at the State Department. And so I split my time between the White House and the State Department, and I was linked with Secretary of State Colin Powell. I was able to learn from him at the closest level of how he ran the department and how he ran U.S. diplomacy. An extraordinary experience. I recommend it to all the American citizens who are listening, who are in mid to junior career. Check it out. And when the fellowship ended after 1 year, I was then tapped to work at the policy planning staff to cover Russia and the former Soviet states, excluding Central Asia. And that was a fascinating experience because it really shows you how the government works in terms of coordinating policy across the interagency process. Because the policy planning people, in addition to looking at longer term questions of U.S. policy and being kind of a think tank for state, an internal think tank, they also coordinate policy on certain questions. So you'd get input from 6, 8, 10 different they call them equity holders in government. And you would always get a better product from having all those views. And that's informed pretty much everything I've done in my career since, is the gathering of views. Did that for a year, and then the position in Moldova came up. And so I was OSCE ambassador, not U.S. ambassador, so it's not Senate confirmed, but it's a selection made at state to advance a candidate who's then confirmed by the OSCE's chairman in office. So I had to go and be confirmed by the Belgian government and the Belgian foreign minister, which I was in 2006, and then off I went to Moldova. So that's a long story of how I got to where I was, but I think it's important because all the elements of my work, legal work, prosecutorial work, government work, all came to bear on this position and the work we did in Moldova.
Well, Lou, I'm really glad you shared that story, because many of our listeners are young professionals, mid-career professionals who are looking to either pivot into or expand their practice in peace negotiations, peace building, conflict resolution. And we have conversations with folks who are former ambassadors and former mediators. And you have someone in their 20s or early 30s thinking, okay, that's great, but how did they get there? What is the path? And what we always discover is there is no linear path. It's finding opportunities, taking advantage of opportunities, and basically developing a skill set that'll be relevant for peace building.
That's right. There's no one path. There's no one journey. The Foreign Service for Americans is a wonderful path, or for non-U.S. citizens in their own countries is a great path. But there's not just that path. You can do it many different ways, as you can see by my little journey through these various institutions.
It's always great to hear for our legal followers that there's a path into big law, out of big law, and then, back in the revolving door, as we like to call it, in Washington, D.C., between the politics, the mediation, and practicing law. So,
Yes.
let's pivot a little bit to your role in Moldova. And what was your role? What were your responsibilities? What were your objectives? What were you trying to accomplish? We talk about building peace, but specifically, how were you trying to move that process forward?
The OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is an interesting organization. It's a consensus-based peace and security organization, essentially for Europe, but with Russian, Canadian, American participation. And it has essentially now 58, formerly 55 ambassadors sent to Vienna to run diplomacy for this entity. And thus, when you're placed in one of the OSCE's missions or embassies around the hotspots, you have essentially 55 or 58 bosses who are looking at what you do. So you have to be very careful in the way you conduct yourself. And each mission, each embassy has a mandate. So our mandate arose from the ceasefire agreement and contained certain elements. One, to try to resolve the Transnistrian conflict, help ultimately later amended to help withdraw Russian troops and ammunition from the area, to develop democratic institutions, but not sort of writ large. So election monitoring as well, minority rights, linguistic rights, human rights were all part of our mandate. So we had a lot to do, even beyond the Transnistrian conflict.
So one of the mechanisms created for trying to resolve this conflict was the 5+2 talks that were established in 2005. And there's Moldova, Transnistria, Russia, and interestingly, Ukraine. So those were the core, with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as the mediator, and the U.S., the EU, and as observers. Talk to us a little bit about this 5+2 structure, and then also, in addition, the role of the OSCE as a mediator and maintaining neutrality, and especially, as an American coming in, changing hats to be OSCE, how were you perceived, and how did you establish and maintain your neutrality in these negotiations?
There are a lot of questions there. Let's start with the 5+2, right? So you mentioned the OSCE, and the head of mission, which I was at the time, was the chief mediator and negotiator for that process. And then the Russians and Ukrainians were the guarantors, so-called guarantors, and the EU and the US were the observers. The format was difficult because it really depended upon a lot of even meeting. The agenda, what we would talk about, trying to resolve the conflict, depended upon external factors that would ebb and flow. So you mentioned 2005, right? The period from, say, 2005 to 2008 was a very difficult one for negotiations. And there really weren't negotiations per se. And we should say a word about negotiations. There's all kinds of flavors of negotiations. During my time in the mission in Moldova, it was more consultations. We did meet in the 5+2 format with some frequency, but it was never allowed to be called negotiations. It was about consultations or negotiations about negotiating, or how to think about the agenda. So it was kept purposefully by one of the parties, kept purposefully as kind of we're here, but we're not going to really advance this. And that was because of all the other things that were happening. Let's take a look at those. So back in 1999, at the Istanbul summit of the OSCE, commitments were made for the withdrawal of the Russian troops and armaments. And this is very important now and for later in our conversation, because listeners should know that there are, in Kolbasna, which is a town in Transnistria, there are maybe 30,000 tons of Soviet-era armaments, which are guarded by a Russian contingent, a very large ammo basically depot. And part of the mission's mandate was, of course, to look at that, inspect that depot, see what was going on, make sure it was safe. You can imagine 30,000 tons of explosives could be a dangerous thing. And after the 1999 summit in Istanbul, commitments were made to begin withdrawing those armaments and withdrawing Russian troops, because at the time, the Russian government was highly interested in the Adapted Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, right? They wanted that to be renewed. And there was then leverage on both sides for some sort of an agreement to do something. Renew the Adapted Treaty, and withdrawals can begin. And they did begin for a time. For a very short period of time, there were withdrawals. They were slow-walked, but it did happen. And then in 2003, there was a secret proposal, what's called the Kozak Memorandum, to federalize Moldova, giving Transnistria an outsized voice in Moldovan politics. And at the last minute, literally at the last hour, then President Voronin of Moldova canceled the deal. And it created a great deal of bad will and upsetment among the Russian side. And so from that period on, really from 2003 on to 2008, 9, beyond, it was very difficult to have talks. And as you know, as anyone who negotiates knows, it's all about your positions, your leverage, what you have to offer and what you want. And so then, just before I came to Moldova, the European Union with Moldova and Ukraine said, and of course we can't forget the 2004 Orange Revolution, which completely changed the trajectory. And everything we think about in terms of Moldova needs to be kept in context of Ukraine. Because remember, unlike the frozen conflicts in Georgia, the Transnistrian conflict is separated by many hundreds of kilometers from Russia. Ukraine completely surrounds the area. So it's a key to anything, negotiations, settlement, trade. Ukraine is key. And so after the Orange Revolution in 2005 and 6, the Europeans and Ukrainians and the Moldovans set up a thing called UBAN, the European Union Border Assistance Mission, which is essentially meant to prevent what I called before the unregulated trade that we had going out of Transnistria by requiring registration of goods leaving the country, so that they placed European, Moldovan, and Ukrainian border and customs officers together on the Transnistrian frontier to check anything coming in or out. And this created a great deal of, as you can imagine, discontent among those who had been taking advantage of the unregulated position of this area, who called it an economic blockade and economic terrorism and all kinds of things. And it just basically tanked the chances for real negotiations. So what you had after, this is a long story, but what you had after these 7 years was no further withdrawals of troops or armaments. You had a border that was getting controlled by Moldova, which is sovereign over that border. And you had the peacekeeping mission, which we should talk about for a second, if I may. So the peacekeeping mission in Moldova is unique because a party to the conflict is one of the peacekeepers. In fact, several parties to the conflict are the peacekeepers. It's a tripartite arrangement where Russian, Transnistrian, and Moldovan peacekeepers are in place. And very difficult to get that changed. Now, on one hand, there's been no incidents in violence really in 30 years. So on the one hand, parties say, hey, look, we don't need this anymore. We can do away with this peacekeeping mission, because there's no danger here. The other side would say, no, there's no danger because we have this peacekeeping mission. So it's a bit of a pull and push on that. We tried very hard in the mission to internationalize the peacekeeping force. In other words, to bring in other parties who were not so engaged or had so much skin in the game on this. And that was, of course, very difficult. In fact, we did extensive work on that, extensive planning for it, but it was not politically viable.
Well, let's pick up a little bit on this theme of territory. We talked about the tripartite customs inspections because it's Moldovan territory, a little bit about the proposal for federalism. At the crux of this is all about territory. This is a chunk of property, territory, land that's Moldovan, that's recognized with the dissolution of the Soviet Union as part of the territorial integrity of Moldova, but occupied or not occupied, controlled by a group that either wants to separate from or have an asymmetrical relationship with the central government in the other parts of Moldova, and as a patron to support it in that effort. What did you find was unique or particularly challenging in negotiating or facilitating, mediating the territorial question?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right that it's about territory. That's true, but it's also about territory writ large as a, again, geopolitical and geoeconomic factor, right? So it's about 11% of Moldova's territory. Moldova's a small country, maybe the size of Connecticut in terms of square mileage or square kilometers. And that's a big chunk of the country. Plus, as I mentioned before, the heavy industry is located there, the power plant, the steel plant, so many other small and medium-sized factories as well. So it's about territory, but it's also about the larger geopolitical post-Soviet expression. And what, rightly or wrongly, and we can't think for others, but rightly or wrongly, Moscow believes that it is in its vital interest to prevent NATO expansion and EU expansion. And we know that because we have a war in Ukraine, which has many causes, but that's one of the important ones on there as well. And so, yeah, it's very difficult when you have a regime that, it's funny, the former foreign minister, so-called foreign minister of Transnistria, once commented famously that, he said, "You may call us a puppet state, but sometimes the puppet can yank the strings and cause changes in policy." So you have all these factors. You've got the Ukrainian factor, the Transnistrian factor of its own interests, the economic factor, the elites in the various capitals, Moldova, Ukraine, of course, being so important to. And we see, in terms of negotiation, if we want to extract a lesson from negotiations, we can look at Ukraine's political orientation and see how that affected Transnistrian negotiations. Because when Ukraine was trying to orient itself towards the West or towards Europe, thinking about accession, Orange Revolution, then, of course, 2009, things became a little bit easier in terms of leverage on meaningful discussions. When Ukraine was more just concerned with keeping everything calm with its northern neighbor, was much more difficult in trying to advance anything on Transnistria. And we can talk later about what do you do? What do you do when you have a situation where there's really no political will to have good faith negotiations? What do you do in that situation? But we'll get to that later, I'm sure.
Let's actually pivot a little bit to that with the challenges you're faced with helping to facilitate a resolution of this conflict. It's quite the conundrum. You have these peacekeepers, which the parties keeping the peace. You have an armaments depot, which is being slow walked, dismantling it. And you have shifting geopolitical sands in the neighborhood. How did you address these challenges? Did you try to build political will? How does one you can't just sit the parties together and say, okay, let's hold hands and, identify our interests and our positions and draft something up. How did you navigate and how did you try to impact?
There was no chance of sitting together and holding hands because there was no will and no interest in doing that. And so what you do then is you pivot to what you can do. You have to be like water as a diplomat or as anyone, a lawyer, anyone professional. You have to be like water. If you can't go this way, let's flow this way. Let's see if we can find a way. Let's go under. Let's go over. Let's see what we can do. Luckily, our mission, the Moldova mission, had a mandate not just on disarmament and withdrawal of troops and the 5+2 negotiations, but also, as I mentioned, on human rights and democracy. And so then you have to look systemically and strategically at what would help create the conditions for encouraging negotiations, for encouraging conversations, for encouraging mutual interests. And what I always told our friends in Moldova was you have to make Moldova attractive. You have to make it attractive by making it such a great place that the Transnistrians and others would like to be, and when I say others, I mean the Gagauzins, which we'll talk about as well in the south, would like to be part of the country. We don't have these problems in Switzerland, right? There's 4 languages, there's many different cultures and views and history, but we don't have that problem because it's an attractive place to be. And so we focused, when we couldn't have direct negotiations on 5+2, we focused on election monitoring, on protecting human rights, protecting minority rights. Freedom of the press was very important. We had a whole section in our mission on freedom of the press, which remains an issue in that part of the world, of course. All of those things were really important. And what was nice about the mission was that it was truly international. We had, a Belarusian security expert. We had a Norwegian human rights expert. We had a deputy from Germany, a press person from Germany. We had a Bulgarian expert on disarmament. We had a British expert on the internationalization of the peacekeeping force. So that was really great, just from a sort of we're all in this together kind of thing.
Let's delve into that a little bit. A number of our guests on the Lawyering Peace podcast have talked about the role of culture, either in negotiations or in particular with mediation teams, because you want as diverse and eclectic a group of experts, but they come with different legal cultures, different political cultures, different historical, social cultures. How did you navigate or bring out the best with an eclectic group of cultures rather than have cultural clashes on your
the first and most important step is just to realize what you just said, right? Don't come into this with your own rules and your own expectations of how, just because you learned this or you did, that doesn't mean it's right. Right? You have to respect all views. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning, my experience at the policy planning staff of seeing all these different points of views. I'd get a document back at policy planning, which I think is no secret, which would be a rainbow of track change comments, right? And some would be great, some would not be so great, some would be quite strident, some less so. But my role was to filter that, respect what was being said, understand what was being said. Even sometimes more than the words is the impulse, the meaning, the reason for that, and then create a synthesis. And that's what I tried to do in Moldova as well. I mean, all these different experts from different legal and political and diplomatic cultures. We have many languages in the mission. We have many things going on. You have to understand everything, listen to everyone. And then the hard part is you've got to make a decision. I spent particular time on building trust, first and foremost with my own team, and then with the parties. And I did that, for example, so linguistic politics in Moldova are quite fraught. One has to be very aware of that. And with language comes culture and cuisine and history and so many different things. So you have to, I made myself learn the local language as soon as I could. And I wound up doing quite a bit of work in the local language, that's being Romanian, but also could work in Russian and English. So every day, 3 languages. And it's important to show that respect to your hosts or your counterpart or whoever you're speaking to understand, I can switch, sure, I'll meet you where you are.
And that helps to build the trust relationship as well. Let's talk about trust in a second. I did want to share a quick story about when I teach my lawyering peace class at American University. We'll do negotiation simulations, and there'll be, as you said, a rainbow of positions and arguments and tension and all of this. And then as we do the lessons learned, I say, do you realize you're all mostly Americans, you're all lawyers, you're all at the same school, and you have this incredible array of deeply felt positions. Okay, take that and amplify it 10 times, parties or with a mediation. And that's one of those, there's only a few sort of aha moments in my class, but that's one of those aha moments that are like, wow, we actually are pretty much homogeneous in our culture and in our profession, and we still have such varied and intense views on how to resolve these conflicts. Just imagine when it's out there outside of the classroom.
Well, that's such a great point. And that's why humility is so important in any kind of negotiation, any kind of discussion, any kind of diplomatic mission. Say, I didn't grow up in this culture. I didn't grow up with these historical pressures, these givens. There's many givens that we take, as say as Americans, others take as Russians, Moldovans, Chinese, whatever it might be, givens that we don't even understand. So a dose of humility goes a long way. Peter the Great said a really interesting thing about translating and interpreting. And he said, and I'm butchering the quote, but it was basically, in essence, don't do it literally. First understand what's being said, and then say it right in the new language. And that can be applied to diplomacy too. First understand where everybody's coming from, and then try to see what can we do here, if anything. Now, that all said, that's all nice talk, right? But then when you're also facing a situation where one party just doesn't want to negotiate, right? Then that's much more difficult, which is why I mentioned pivoting to all the other things we could do in the mission in terms of human rights, electoral rights, press freedoms, things like that. And abstracting away from Moldova and Transnistria, you can have situations in negotiations where those who don't want to negotiate shift. Depending on external factors and leverage, it can be today they don't want to talk, tomorrow we don't want to talk. The next day the third party doesn't want to talk. So then what do you do, right? It's important to keep that, at least some kind of contact going, connection, respect at least. You cannot be liked by your counterpart, but you have to be respected.
And one of the things that oftentimes folks will say, well, you're working on a peace process in Sudan, but at the moment there's no political will, or you're working on a peace process in Libya. I'm like, totally agree with you. But when that political will crystallizes and they turn and they say, okay, where's that draft peace agreement? And I'm like, oh, I'm at the beach because I figured you guys were never going to have any political will.
Right.
That's #fail me. And so, as you say, as the mediator, as a lawyer, you want to be prepared. So when it does crystallize, it may not, but when it does crystallize, you're able to do your part in your role.
You read my mind, Paul, because that's why these missions exist. That is it takes a while to realize that. A new ambassador, a new diplomat, a new person can come in and say, oh, we have to do something right away. That's also perhaps a very American view, right? That we can solve things and we actually have power and agency. We sometimes don't. But what you've just said is so key. It's understanding you've got to be there when the conditions are right. And being there means having done the work to build the trust. So as you said, when they turn to you, there's something there.
Lou, if you could share with our listeners a handful of helpful tips for maintaining trust, because you mentioned it a number of times, and a number of our guests on the podcast have spoken about that incredible need to actually build and maintain trust, either as a mediator, facilitator, or as an opposing party. If you ever are going to get to yes and sign an agreement, you need to have trust for implementation. What are some of the things in particular that you did to build and then to maintain that trust?
Well, we mentioned a few already, and I'll repeat a few and say a few new ones. One is just to be someone who they see as understanding where they're coming from. And that comes from knowing the history, knowing the language that they speak, speaking that language, if it's possible. Not all people have time for that or can do that, but it's very important if you can. But it's also about, to this, oh, I'm on the beach comment. It's continuous outreach, even when you're told to go away, or you're told we don't want to talk, or we're told there's nothing to say. It's just keeping in touch, little things. Maybe not yourself. We had a team, right? So we always had someone reaching out to the counterparts in Transnistria, reaching out to the Moldovan government, reaching out to different actors, Ukraine, Kiev, Moscow, whatever. It's being in constant touch with them. And then it's finding things, it's a little more tricky, finding things that they, maybe not directly it's indirection, not misdirection, indirection. It's finding things that other side cares about that maybe you can help with. So I'll give you an example. The 5+2 talks were fraught and not advancing. But there were issues between the two sides that were very important to their well-being and their data. For example, can you get a registration for your university degree to work abroad? Can you use your Transnistria license plate to travel to Moldova? Can we cross this certain road? Can farmers get access to their roads? For the Moldovans, there was a very important issue that came up from time to time of the Romanian language, Romanian script schools, which would be shut from time to make a provocation, and we'd have to resolve that. So when those things come up, you have to have those contacts. They're not directly related to the peace process or the negotiation process, but they're so important to everything. And if the conditions are right and you've resolved something together before, it's much easier to resolve a bigger question.
You've mentioned license plates, and I'm amazed how many times in lawyering peace, I've had to draft up provisions relating to the license plates. And we were doing the Macedonians were doing a celebration, a 20-year celebration of the Lake Ohrid Accords. And when Ahmedi gave his presentation, he was shouting out various folks that had worked with him. And when he gave a shout out to me, he was like, and Paul was our lawyer. And he was so focused on everything. He even wrote a provision for us on license plates. And everyone's like, what? And it's actually a big deal with the Albanian license plates, the Kosovo, who can travel where in the script. But yes, for our listeners, don't underestimate the value of helping to crack the code or crack the nut on.
Absolutely. That's a great example, because the same thing happened in Moldova with Transnistrian plates. And it's an issue, it's a bread and butter issue. It's an issue that affects lots of people and can be a win if you can pull it off as you did with that thing you drafted there.
And one thing I hadn't realized, this gets back to your comment about certain cultural things or certain practices are baked in. When I first started working with the Bosnians, they were very focused on license plates. And I said, okay, why are you so focused on license plates? And they said, because you can tell the ethnic identity of the person driving the car based upon the letters in their license plate, because it tells what town they're from. And I was like, in Bosnia, those first few letters are the town that you're from. It was the same thing in Macedonia with are you from Tetovo or are you from Skopje? And so those types of things, those ethnic indicators, we think of it as a license plate, but for them, it was an ethnic indicator.
No, that's a really important point, because think about the Transnistrian conflict. We always would say in the mission, this is the most solvable of the frozen conflicts, because there is really no ethnic issue in the way you're describing with the license plates and the town and the locality and wanting to know that information. Everybody's mixed. Yes, everyone speaks many languages in the area. Transnistria is roughly 1/3 Russian, Ukrainian, Moldovan. Moldova is much more Moldovan, but everyone, essentially speaks Russian as well. And unlike some groups, the Moldovans are very welcoming and kind people. So if you have 10 people together and one speaks Russian and 9 speak Romanian, they'll all speak Russian. So we don't have that same sort of hardened ethnic view, which is a good thing. And yet it's still a hard nut to crack, even without that problem.
You find in these frozen conflicts that things that weren't politicized become politicized as tools of maintaining the frozen nature of the conflict.
Yes.
Since the podcast is entitled Lawyering Peace, let's pivot a little bit to the legal mandate of the OSCE mission. It was drafted in the 90s. I assume it still existed more or less in its original form. A compound question. When you arrived in Moldova, and the first thing you did, presumably, or obviously before you got there, was to read the mandate, the legal mandate. Was it sufficient? You're a lawyer looking at a political mandate with legal repercussions. Was it sufficient? And is it currently sufficient? And does it need to be evolved?
The mission's mandate was initially drafted in 1992, but then it was, of course, modified and amended after the Istanbul Accords that we mentioned, the Istanbul Summit that we mentioned, to include different parts like withdrawal of the troops and more of a human rights dimension to it. But again, these are essentially political documents. There's no, it's not like we're going to go to the Supreme Court and argue something. Yes, international law exists. It is very important, of course, but it's difficult, right? This is great power politics here that we're dealing with. So the trick in those circumstances, to my mind, is to be true to the document, right? Here we had a mandate signed by all OSCE member states to do certain things. And so then if you're not able to do those things, you have the argument that, well, the mandate is being thwarted. Please help us to unlock the mandate. So you come back, your point is the right one. It's about what is the legal agreed upon document and how do you use it? It reminds me sort of the original 1975 Helsinki Accords, right? Where dissidents could use the actual language that had been agreed to make their points in a very difficult environment. Same thing here. But unfortunately, you have to shift your mentality. What do they say? Where you stand is where you sit, right? So you're not a lawyer anymore when you're an ambassador or a high-level negotiator. It's much more than that. So you use all the tools in your arsenal, in your toolbox, including a legal one, when you can.
Lou, how did your training as a lawyer facilitator amplify your ability to be a facilitator, mediator, or to be honest, did it hinder it?
Enormously helpful, because when you have been trained as a lawyer, as a younger person, say in a big firm or in a prosecutor's office or an agency, you have to know everything about the case that you have before you. Every fact, every detail, every party, you have to read everything. So to your point, right, first thing you do is you get to this mission is you read everything that you can find, and you read history, and you talk to people, and you interview them. So it's very similar in that regard, in the preparatory regard, in the getting ready regard. But then you don't have a court to go to. That's where you don't have that ultimate recourse, and you're more trying to bring people together. So that's where it's different. I don't think it's a hindrance at all. I think the training was exceptionally helpful. And we've seen many lawyers succeed in business and in diplomacy and other areas, I think, because of their training. But it's not everything. It's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient.
That's a great jobs advertisement for a jobs program for lawyers. I'm going to play this clip over and over to my law students and aspiring law students. Well, Lou, let's
let me just, if you're going to do that, then I'll just add to it that the notion, law is a high pressure job with great responsibility. And so when you get trained as a young lawyer in a high pressure environment, it's kind of like you have to play with pain. You have to get through the all-nighter. You have to get it done. And in that sense, there's a little bit of a kind of a military style focus on the mission, emphasis in that. And I like that very much about law, that we're the professionals in the room. We're going to get this done. People will look to us for guidance. We better be prepared. We better be ready. We better step up.
But one of the things I've noticed with our pro bono clients, be it mediators or heads of state delegation or non-state armed actors, there's an intense level of pressure. They're negotiating the future of their country. They're negotiating the end of war, trying to get a ceasefire or a peace agreement. And that ability to be mentally focused, literally 24/7. We all talk about 24/7. Working on a peace process, you know what 24/7 means. Being a facilitator, you know what 24/7 means, because you have to be, on your game constantly, because the stakes are so significant.
But Paul, there's a poignant, I agree with everything you said, and there's a poignant corollary to that, which is that there's great risk to you in many cases as the negotiator, because not always do you have everyone on your side wanting to do what's being proposed to do. And you're out there, you're the face of that decision to take this political course, this legal course, whatever it may be, and others may disagree. And history is full of examples of subsequent violence against those who brought peace.
No, it's a tricky place to be in. You're making history. You're part of your country or a country's history, but there's incredible risk associated with being part of a peace process as a party, as a mediator. Let's focus a little bit on your successes. It was a tough time. It was a frozen conflict. There were issues relating to trust and compliance that we've talked about. But what are a couple of the successes that you're most proud of from your time in Moldova that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So we've just talked a lot about the notion of a continuity of the mission or of being there when the time is right for serious negotiations. One thing I'm very proud of is that I left the mission to my successor in a much better state than I found it, in the sense that we doubled our staff and got the right people in the right positions from the right countries. And that was not easy because, again, the budgetary issues in the OSCE, like anywhere, are political, and it's a consensus-based organization. So you had to have everyone agree to budgetary changes. And the way you do that, the way we did that, was to build alliances. Again, same thing we've been talking about. Iterative conversations, constant contact, building alliances that can help you to protect your budget or enhance it as we did. We left the Tiraspol office, which is, of course, the capital of Transnistria. We left that in completely renovated, better than it was before. That was important to me as well. Leaving something behind for the next person, so it might be just a little bit easier, was extremely important. We did a lot of work on press monitoring, press freedoms, and election monitoring. And I'm happy to say that everything that we saw was pretty good on the Moldovan side during elections. And then we were able to get into the arms depot at Kolbasna for the first time in many years to do some inspection and to assess safety. And that to me was enormously important. We did that. We weren't able to do that directly. That was not going to happen. The mission itself was not going to get access to Kolbasna because that would have implied that the soil is ripe for negotiations, or we want to be constructive, or so we couldn't. It would have been impossible. So what we did was, again, a little bit of creative diplomacy. We invited all the OSCE ambassadors from the capitals who sit in Vienna, come to Vienna, to Moldova to visit Kolbasna. And it was much harder for the Transnistrian and other authorities to turn down 55, or in our case, I think 42 came, ambassadors from capitals and from Vienna, than to turn the little mission down in Moldova. So we actually got the access for our inspectors for the first time as part of this approach, this different kind of creative approach that we used. And we even were able to drive those ambassadors over a bridge across the river, the Dniester River, that had been blocked for years by the Transnistrians. Now, I will tell you that effort, successful as it was, had a cost. And it put us on the radar screen as, oh, these people are trying to get things done and we don't really want that. So and it led actually to more difficulties in other areas because we were able to outflank in this area. So you don't know the consequences, but we still thought that it was worth that cost because we were able to inspect and assess safety for this 30,000-ton arms depot in Transnistria.
And did your team come away a little more relaxed about the safety, or more concerned about the safety?
No, that was why it was worth the cost. And it was a cost because we felt, at least there's no imminent danger. And that's been borne out since at least that was in 2006, actually, in November. And now, 18 years later, nothing's blown up, thank goodness.
Well, that's an incredibly important lesson, because oftentimes folks will think, oh, if we get a little bit of progress here, it'll create momentum. So and the cost benefit analysis is simply, okay, how difficult is it going to be able to make this particular step? It'll create momentum. But there's actually the cost of eroding momentum or reversing momentum. And so assessing something like the arms depot, well, that's, high priority to get that figured out. It's worth it if there's a cost of momentum in other areas.
And there was. And, we did an assessment. We didn't think that there was going to be a breakthrough in, say, having serious, good faith 5+2 negotiations, right? So losing that chip didn't seem so bad if we could get some comfort and security about the safety situation in the depot. So trade-offs, playing your cards right. That one, that worked out okay, but there was just I do want to emphasize for listeners, there was a cost afterwards.
And being aware of those costs and being able to factor them into the cost benefit analysis is crucial.
Or yes, or there will be a cost. We don't know what it's going to be, but at least we expect that something will happen.
It's good to be thinking that way so that you know what you're getting into, or that there will be some costs associated with moving forward with something you're trying to achieve. Lou, talk to us about Gagauzia and the degree to which it's restive. And, oftentimes when there's a frozen conflict, such as Transnistria, everybody focuses on that, and then it'll pop up somewhere else in the country. How worried should we be about it, and what might be the drivers of conflict there?
So just as we saw the rise of the conflicts at the fall of the Soviet Union, Karabakh, Georgia, Moldova, others, we had within Moldova its own little separatist impulse from the Gagauz people, who had always been very pro-Moscow, Russian-speaking group in the south, had settled as Christian Turks who had settled under Catherine in Moldova. And, they also wanted some self-determination rights. And so we have this, to bring it back to law, we have this interesting tension all the time between the right to territorial integrity and the right to self-determination of peoples, both internal and external self-determination. And so as part of quelling the restiveness in Gagauzia, a deal was struck and only completed in 1995, actually, that would modify the constitution to include Gagauzia within Moldova, but give it kind of a safety valve that if there's a change in status of Moldova, then it has the right, and these terms are all written vaguely, so we don't know what they mean, and we can't decide today what they mean, but if there's a change of status, political status of Moldova, then Gagauzia has the right to isn't succeed, but to self-determination. And that was meant at the time, right? The spirit of that, what informed that was a talk of possible reunification with Romania, which was unpalatable to the Gagauz. That never really went anywhere. There was always a small minority of Moldovans who wanted to reunify with Romania, but not a large position on that. But now we're facing the EU accession. Is that going to count as a change in status as you give up some sovereignty, some legal sovereignty and economic sovereignty? Don't know. We don't know. Would that trigger the escape clause? Hard to say. So it's an open question. So you've got a really interesting mosaic here of the Transnistrian conflict, which is frozen and has the Russian influence. And we still haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is Ukraine, which we'll get to. And then you've got the Gagauzia situation, which could be another kind of Swiss cheese hole in the country, were there to be actual, interpretation of the escape clause. To me, we're out of here.
In that change in the status of Moldova. One of the things we always...
If that's a change in status, right? If accession and ceding some sovereignty to Brussels means you've then changed your status as an object of international law, subject of international law.
One of the things we always emphasize with our pro bono clients doing peace negotiations is words matter. And there's oftentimes an impetus by mediators for constructive ambiguity. So you can say this word means many things depending on who you're talking to. And we constantly push back with our clients and say, look, actually these words matter. At some point in time, you or the other party is going to pull out this document, point to these words, and what they say will actually matter. And we see that with the Budapest Memorandum from 1994 with Ukraine and the Russians and the Brits and the Americans and the others, where the Ukrainians thought they were getting security guarantees for turning their nuclear weapons over to the Russians. It turns out they're getting assurances, and yes, assurances are not guarantees. It's just one word, but it really changed the security profile of Ukraine, in particular with respect to the 2014 and now the 2022 conflict.
Well, let's take that word, guarantee or guarantor, and look at it in this context. So in this context, in the 5+2 talks, Russia and Ukraine are guarantors. What does that mean? We don't know. We don't know. The same thing you just said about the Budapest Memorandum. It's not clear what that means. Can a guarantor be a party to the conflict? Can it plausibly say it's not a party to the conflict? What is it guaranteeing? It's
What rights and privileges does the guarantor have? What obligations?
exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine now. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, because that's changed it's changed so many dynamics in Europe. What impact has that had on Moldova, the Transnistria conflict, or the future of resolving this conflict?
Yeah, the war in Ukraine is extremely important, as is Ukraine itself and always has been for Transnistrian settlement. Ukraine, because of pure geographic reality, is key to, and we talked about that in the context of UBAM, the border assistance mission, and controlling the border, because, just to repeat, unlike other frozen conflicts in the former Soviet space, there's no contiguous border between the Russian Federation and Moldova. Ukraine's in between, and it's quite a great distance. So those armaments, those soldiers have to be, Russian soldiers in Transnistria have to be resupplied or withdrawn or whatever through Ukraine. That certainly for the armaments, you could fly them out, I guess, but no, there are no flights anymore anyway. What's happened since the war started is that the border is sealed. The Transnistrian Ukrainian border is sealed. And that, as we talked so much about, leverage in the talks and interests of the parties, that inevitably reorients exporters, producers, economic elites in Transnistria towards Moldova and towards the West, because they can't then be exporting to Russia or to Ukraine. So that is a sea change in where we are. Really important. And in theory, Transnistrian elites would begin to see, oh yeah, look, we can have a good future. It can be attractive to work with, the Moldovans and Brussels to our economic advantage and to basically enrich ourselves, which is one thing. Another factor caused by the war is that the 5+2 format really is not viable at this point, at this time. The Ukrainians are not going to sit down with the Russians about Transnistria. I don't think any of the parties really wish to sit down with each other right now about that. And the Transnistrians can see that the game is changing, but they don't know how it's going to change. They don't know where it's going to land. And so everybody's watching and waiting to see. And that's why it's so important, right? I mentioned having top quality negotiators for accession to do this in parallel while this uncertainty is taking place. And uncertainty is such a poor word for it. This horror is taking place in Ukraine. The Moldovans have to be moving as quickly as they can
and somehow finding a way to make use of this time in transition caused by the war in Ukraine to.
Well, there's no doubt that, right, that they're getting attention that they would not have had otherwise. It's certainly on the forefront of Brussels' mind as to what are we going to do, what's going to happen here with these two countries.
One of the things that we've discovered over time is that these windows of opportunity open and then close. And oftentimes those that have a window that have opened think that it's going to stay open for a lot longer than it actually does. Let's bring this up to the current time a little bit and talk about EU accession. Alu, in recent weeks, there have been extensive conversations and analysis about how the presidential election and the referendum could impact Moldova's path to EU membership. Now that both votes are in, they've brought plenty of surprises and tense moments as the results rolled in. Let's discuss a little bit the referendum to add Moldova's EU path to its constitution. The vote was so close that it felt uncertain until the very last ballot was counted. Walk us through what happened here.
Well, Paul, it really was that close. And it was the diaspora, actually, the diaspora mostly in America and in Europe, but even more, you could see it happening physically as you watched that night when the U.S. votes began coming in from the diaspora. You could see the vote shift in favor of the EU accession. So the Moldovans living outside the country played an enormous role here. It was really an important thing that they did. And, this is an interesting referendum because it was placed at the beginning of accession, not towards the conclusion, not to be a cherry on top and ratify the people's decision, but at the very beginning of the process. We're looking at 6, 7, 5, who knows how many years still of negotiations on accession. So it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. But as we know, there were political reasons for linking up the referendum with the presidential elections, and that was criticized by many, both in Moldova and even the Venice Commission criticized that timing of the two events. But look, it's passed, and there's now at least momentum for the hard work ahead on EU accession. I think it was so close, Paul, because a lot of people didn't even understand what the question meant. It was so vaguely worded that they didn't know what they'd be voting for, what that would mean in practice, in application to the Constitution, and how it would turn out. And of course, it also indicates, it suggests Moldova's persisting divisions about where it's going, east versus west. It's nothing new. It's been decades like that. The divisions are really deep and they still persist. That said, I don't think there needs to be what we used to call a proliferation of referenda here. They've got their marching orders. Society has voted 50% plus to move towards EU accession. And there's a fragile consensus around that now has to be bolstered with really, really hard work, while still respecting all the realities that, the geographic realities, political realities, linguistic realities, cultural, historical realities that Moldova faces. You're not going to just forget about the connections to the eastern neighbor that have been there for centuries, that have to be taken into account. When I think about the referendum, I think about, look at how the Baltics are, right? So the Baltics have plenty of problems with their interethnic relations, linguistic problems, other issues, but nobody living in Narva in Estonia, right? None of the Russian speakers living in Narva is keen to move to Ivangorod across the river. And so that's what you want to have in Moldova, where, yes, we have these different groups and perspectives, but we can harmonize them on a consensus where everyone lives better and does better and has a better future, better opportunities by being in the EU. And that's the Baltic model for all of its flaws. That's worked in the Baltics. And I think it can work in Moldova as well. And there's another thing that I've been thinking about, which is we did the report that we've talked about, the rapid response report. And we mentioned in that report the Moldovans' personal, individual EU accession. People making a choice to take another citizenship, for example, to take, as they can, as of right, to take Romanian citizenship, an EU member. And many, many Moldovans have done that. So you wonder, right, how much did those personal decisions to, I'm acceding personally to the EU as an individual, affect turnout, affect the vote? Maybe people, on the well, I don't really need to vote because I'm already in the EU as an individual, as a family. I think that's an important factor here, that could have affected both the turnout and the vote itself.
Lou, let's pick up a little bit on your point about the perpetual divisions that exist in Moldovan society. And with the very close referendum vote, do you think that this might create space for the opposition to push back against the momentum on the path towards EU membership? Or is this somehow going to impact the government's approach to EU membership?
Well, Paul, it's already happening. It's already happening. There's already pushback by the opposition. There have been protests against the referendum, against the elections. There have been protests at the headquarters of the Electoral Commission, for example. And, a large part of the population is clearly not satisfied with the way the campaign was organized, with the way the presidential elections were linked to the referendum, with the way that opposition candidates didn't have, and it's widely been observed, didn't have equal access to the media, to channels to make their voice be heard. That's really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And in fact, even the OSCE's preliminary reports have, shown these irregularities. They attest to them. So there's work to be done. And I think President Sandu understands that. Her message was one of reconciliation right after the election. There's been a reshuffling of the government. It's taking place right now. The dust hasn't settled yet, so we can't even really comment on that. But I think she realizes that she's got to get moving and move away from kind of the positioning, the talk, and get to the hard work of EU accession and dealing with 35 chapters and harmonizing and moving forward. And if they can do that and show real results, I think that there's a good path there for Moldova. The interest remains strong. The Moldova's partners in the EU are extremely dedicated both to the project and clearly to President Sandu, given that they gave her their full support. One thing we should mention, Paul, is that Chisinau, the capital, leaders in Moldova have to make a better effort to reach out to Gagauzia. The opponent was Gagauz. He lost in the second round. There is that escape clause in the constitution that allows for an undetermined change of status for Gagauzia if Moldova's status is changed. The Gagauzia situation could be another kind of Swiss cheese hole in the country were there to be actual, interpretation of the escape clause. To me, we're out of here. Right? Accession and ceding some sovereignty to Brussels means you've then changed your status as an object of international law, subject of international law. And so it's really incumbent upon Chisinau to reach out to Conrad, work with Conrad, explain the benefits of EU accession, and show real results. So it's not just words, but actually things that people can see.
Well, Lou, let's pick up on the closeness of the presidential race as well. The president won re-election by 55% of the vote in a second round runoff election. How is the closeness of that vote going to affect or compound the impacts on the path to EU membership that you just noted?
Well, all of the above, right? All the points above that, there are strong voices that see it differently or would like a different future. And it's really incumbent upon leadership to show why this is the right. So there's been a majority vote for, why is this the right path? And it's not like the work stops once you have a 50+ vote. You have to really show people why it's in their economic, their social, their developmental interests to be part of the EU. I just put a footnote in, right? So 55% actually compared to US elections is a pretty good success. We're so used to, 50 plus 508 votes or 50 plus a little bit or plurality that that's actually not that bad. And it does show, no one knew the result beforehand. So it does show at least that there's serious real elections in Moldova. However, the referendum should probably be a one-off. Maybe once they get through the 35 chapters and they're ready to do it, maybe there'll be another one, to put the cherry on top. But best, as we've seen with Brexit, best not to be kicking hornets' nests. And more important, to move ahead quickly to build momentum and do the hard work of negotiating the 35 chapters.
So walk us through a little bit what you predict the president will do in order to build momentum for EU membership, as well as just generally maximize the utility of her second term. She'll obviously be facing some challenges, but what are your predictions for the coming years?
Well, it's not smart to make predictions, so I won't make any predictions. What she should do is try to really rally society around this new vision, bring in opposition figures into the process, include them in negotiations, include, for example, the opposition candidate somehow in the work, and most importantly, appoint the very best people to begin negotiating these chapters, the very best people that Moldova can find to ensure a good outcome for the country, and one that is widely seen, right, in the country as free, as fair, and appropriate for Moldova's future.
Well, Lou, any other observations that you would like to share with our listeners about the referendum on the path towards EU membership or about the presidential election?
Yeah, society remains divided, but that's nothing that we're not used to. It's nothing new for Moldova. It's been like that since independence. And it's going to be a struggle to get the country now towards one goal and build a truly cohesive democratic society. But Maya Sandu, she has some degree of mandate to do that. And again, I think the Baltic experience is quite instructive here, right? So, you can live a good life as a Russian speaker in a country and not want to join Russia, but rather be part of a new project, like they might be in, Estonia or in Latvia or elsewhere. I don't see people, again, leaving Narva for Ivangorod at this point. And that's what you'd like to see with Moldova. We talked a lot about making Moldova attractive to Transnistria. Well, you have to make Moldova attractive to right bank people as well in Moldova, not just left bank people. And so what I've been saying, for at least 15 years since I was ambassador in Moldova, OSCE ambassador, was you have to make Moldova attractive, and EU accession is a really good way to do that. So best of luck to Moldova in the next steps.
Lou, talk to us a little bit more about Gagauzia and the degree to which it's restive. And, oftentimes when there's a frozen conflict, such as Transnistria, everybody focuses on that, and then it'll pop up somewhere else in the country. How worried should we be about it, and what might be the drivers of conflict there?
So just as we saw the rise of the conflicts at the fall of the Soviet Union, Karabakh, Georgia, Moldova, others, we had within Moldova its own little separatist impulse from the Gagauz people, who had always been very pro-Moscow, Russian-speaking group in the south, had settled as Christian Turks who had settled under Catherine in Moldova. And, they also wanted some self-determination rights. And so we have this, to bring it back to law, we have this interesting tension all the time between the right to territorial integrity and the right to self-determination of peoples, both internal and external self-determination. And so as part of quelling the restiveness in Gagauzia, a deal was struck and only completed in 1995, actually, that would modify the constitution to include Gagauzia within Moldova, but give it kind of a safety valve that if there's a change in status of Moldova, then it has the right, and these terms are all written vaguely, so we don't know what they mean, and we can't decide today what they mean, but if there's a change of status, political status of Moldova, then Gagauzia has the right to isn't succeed, but to self-determination. And that was meant at the time, right? The spirit of that, what informed that was an talk of possible reunification with Romania, which was unpalatable to the Gagauz. That never really went anywhere. There was always a small minority of Moldovans who wanted to reunify with Romania, but not a large position on that. But now we're facing the EU accession. Is that going to count as a change in status, as you give up some sovereignty, some legal sovereignty and economic sovereignty? Don't know. We don't know. Would that trigger the escape clause? Hard to say. So it's an open question. So you've got a really interesting mosaic here of the Transnistrian conflict, which is frozen and has the Russian influence. And we still haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is Ukraine, which we'll get to. And then you've got the Gagauzia situation, which could be another kind of Swiss cheese hole in the country, were there to be actual, interpretation of the escape clause. To me, we're out of here.
In that change in the status of Moldova. One of the things we always...
If that's a change in status, right? If accession and ceding some sovereignty to Brussels means you've then changed your status as an object of international law, subject of international law.
One of the things we always emphasize with our pro bono clients doing peace negotiations is words matter. And there's oftentimes an impetus by mediators for constructive ambiguity. So you can say this word means many things depending on who you're talking to. And we constantly push back with our clients and say, look, actually these words matter. At some point in time, you or the other party is going to pull out this document, point to these words, and what they say will actually matter. And we see that with the Budapest Memorandum from 1994 with Ukraine and the Russians and the Brits and the Americans and the others, where the Ukrainians thought they were getting security guarantees for turning their nuclear weapons over to the Russians. And turns out they're getting assurances, and I guess assurances are not guarantees. It's just one word, but it really changed the security profile of Ukraine, in particular with respect to the 2014 and now the 2022 conflict.
Well, and let's take that word, guarantee or guarantor, and look at it in this context. So in this context, in the 5+2 talks, Russia and Ukraine are guarantors. What does that mean? We don't know. We don't know. The same thing you just said about the Budapest Memorandum. It's not clear what that means. Can a guarantor be a party to the conflict? Well, can it plausibly say it's not a party to the conflict? What is it guaranteeing? It's
What rights and privileges does the guarantor have? What obligations?
Exactly.
Lou, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine now. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, because that's changed it's changed so many dynamics in Europe. What impact has that had on Moldova, the Transnistria conflict, or the future of resolving this conflict?
Yeah, the war in Ukraine is extremely important, as is Ukraine itself and always has been for Transnistrian settlement. Ukraine, because of pure geographic reality, is key to, and we talked about that in the context of UBAM, the border assistance mission, and controlling the border, because, just to repeat, unlike other frozen conflicts in the former Soviet space, there's no contiguous border between the Russian Federation and Moldova. Ukraine's in between, and it's quite a great distance. So those armaments, those soldiers have to be, Russian soldiers in Transnistria have to be resupplied or withdrawn or whatever through Ukraine. That certainly for the armaments, you could fly them out, I guess, but no, there are no flights anymore anyway. What's happened since the war started is that the border is sealed. The Transnistrian Ukrainian border is sealed. And that, as we talked so much about, leverage in the talks and interests of the parties, that inevitably reorients exporters, producers, economic elites in Transnistria towards Moldova and towards the West, because they can't then be exporting to Russia or to Ukraine. So that is a sea change in where we are. Really important. And in theory, Transnistrian elites would begin to see, oh yeah, look, we can have a good future. It can be attractive to work with, the Moldovans and Brussels to our economic advantage and to basically enrich ourselves, which is one thing. Another factor caused by the war is that the 5+2 format really is not viable at this point, at this time. The Ukrainians are not going to sit down with the Russians about Transnistria. I don't think any of the parties really wish to sit down with each other right now about that. And the Transnistrians can see that the game is changing, but they don't know how it's going to change. They don't know where it's going to land. And so everybody's watching and waiting to see. And that's why it's so important, right? I mentioned having top quality negotiators for accession to do this in parallel while this uncertainty is taking place. And uncertainty is such a poor word for it. This horror is taking place in Ukraine. The Moldovans have to be moving as quickly as they can
and somehow finding a way to make use of this time in transition caused by the war in Ukraine to.
Well, there's no doubt that, right, that they're getting attention that they would not have had otherwise. It's certainly on the forefront of Brussels' mind as to what are we going to, what's going to happen here with these two countries.
One of the things that we've discovered over time is that these windows of opportunity open and then close. And oftentimes those that have a window that have opened think that it's going to stay open for a lot longer than it actually does. What's about the whole EU accession? Lou, as we mentioned earlier, a number of our listeners are early career or mid-career lawyers, diplomats, others who want to know more about conflict resolution, negotiation, the role of lawyers and negotiators and diplomats in building a durable peace. What are 2 or 3 takeaways that you want our listeners to remember from this conversation?
Well, don't lose faith. What you're doing is so important. Diplomacy. So as Colin Powell famously told me when I was starting out as a Weddellsville, he says, jaw, meaning talk is better than war and fight. So, these institutions, the OSCE, the UN, they can be criticized. They're highly criticized at times. Reform is needed, this and that, but we need them. We need those institutions. And it's really important work. Don't lose faith. And again, to the earlier sort of tips, do everything you can do to treat it like you are the expert. You have to know everything about this conflict, everything about the players, everything about the history. And then you become at least indispensable to the process.
Well, Lou, I wanted to thank you for taking your time with us today to share these thoughts and insights and to make me and our listeners smart on the Transnistria conflict, the future of how this conflict might become unfrozen and solved, Moldova's EU trajectory. I've known you and worked with you for over a decade. It's been a real honor and privilege over that decade to work with you on a number of projects, and I've really enjoyed our conversation today. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and your insights on building a durable peace.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a great pleasure to be with you and to work with you on all these important projects over the years. The work you're doing at PILPG is indispensable around the world. We're so impressed by it. It's so valuable. I would like to say one last thing, if I might. Also, remember that for a long time, the consensus view or the received wisdom was that, no, you can't have accession in Moldova without resolving the Transnistrian conflict. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that people are changing their view on that. And a really good example, of course, is the Cyprus accession in 2004, where unfortunately the whole of the island couldn't enter at the same time, but part did. And I think Protocol 10 of that agreement is extremely important here, which extended the European project to part of Cyprus, but then recognized the reality, left the door open for the rest of the island to join. And I do see why, of course, why that would be problematic, but it's at least a precedent, a helpful precedent for Moldova if, in fact, we get to 2030, which is what people think is the earliest possible time to be ready for Moldova, and the conflict isn't resolved, well, we do have this useful precedent to look at. And I think that might be quite powerful.
And that fits with your early theme of being creative and flowing like water, finding a way to solve the problem and to make things happen.
Yes. Thank you, Paul.